I am 68 years old, and I need you to hear this before you judge me. I did not cheat on my wife. I did not gamble away our savings. I did not disappear for weekends or build a second life. From the outside, I was the kind of man other husbands pointed to and said, solid guy. And yet, when I look back across 46 years of marriage, I carry a truth that weighs more than any mistake with a headline. I never truly loved my wife the way she deserved. If you're a man somewhere between 55 and 70 living in Ohio or Ontario or outside Manchester, you probably understand the kind of confession this is. It's not dramatic. It doesn't involve sirens or courtrooms. It's quieter than that. It's the slow realization that you built a life on responsibility and called it love. I married her in the spring of 1979. I was 22 working at a steel plant outside Pittsburgh. The mills were already shrinking, but we didn't know that yet. We still believed in paychecks that lasted decades. She was 19 when we met, smart, soft-spoken, with a stubborn streak that showed up when she talked about going back to school one day. On our wedding day, I remember standing in a rented tux that didn't quite fit, staring at her walking down the aisle of a small brick church. She looked steady, hopeful, like she was stepping into something certain. When it came time for vows, I promised to provide. I promised to protect. I promised to stay. I never said, I love you, in my own words. Not because I didn't feel something. I did. But where I come from, men didn't build sentences around feelings. My father never told my mother he loved her. He paid the mortgage. He changed the oil. He showed up. That was his language. So I copied it. That was the first turning point, though I didn't see it then. I confused loyalty with love. I believed if I stayed, that was enough. A week after the wedding, I left her alone in our apartment surrounded by unopened boxes because I'd picked up an extra shift. She stood in the doorway holding a dish towel and said, "You don't have to rush back. We could unpack together." I kissed her forehead and said, "We'll have plenty of time." What I meant was, I'm afraid of falling behind. I'm afraid of being the guy who can't provide. I'm afraid of becoming my uncle who got laid off and never recovered. But what she heard was, work matters more than this moment. That's how it started. Not with cruelty. With fear. Through the 80s, when layoffs rolled through like winter storms, I tightened up even more. I stopped talking about worries. I stopped asking about hers. When her mother got sick, she would sit at the kitchen table after visiting the hospital and try to tell me what the doctors said. I would nod, glance at the clock, think about early alarms and overtime. One night she said, "Do you ever get scared?" I answered, "No. We'll be fine." It sounded strong. It sounded dependable. It wasn't honest. Here's the internal choice I kept making over and over. I could open up and risk looking weak, or I could stay composed and feel safe. Every time I chose safe. You tell yourself you're protecting your family. You tell yourself men don't burden their wives with doubt. You convince yourself that silence is strength. Years passed. We bought a small house in '86, right before the first big scare at the plant. When the industry started collapsing, I pivoted into sales. Long drives. Late dinners. Weekend calls. She adapted to each version of me without complaint. She made friends. Volunteered. Talked occasionally about finishing her degree. I would say, maybe when things settle down. Things never settle down. There's always a next promotion, a next recession, a next headline telling you the world is unstable. And slowly, without either of us announcing it, our marriage turned into a partnership of logistics. Bills paid. Holidays hosted. Cars maintained. No affairs. No screaming matches. Just two capable adults running a household efficiently. If you had asked me at 50 whether I loved my wife, I would have said, "Of course I do." And I would have believed it. But love isn't just endurance. It's presence. It's curiosity. It's choosing to know the person across from you even after decades. Somewhere along the way I stopped choosing. The shift came this past year after a funeral. An old friend from the mill passed away. Heart attack at 67. At the reception, his widow stood by the coffee urn telling stories about how he used to leave her notes in the glove compartment, how he'd drive out to the lake just to sit with her when she was anxious. I drove home unsettled. That night, I watched my wife washing dishes under the yellow kitchen light. Same woman who walked toward me in that church in '79. Same steady presence. I tried to remember the last time I'd looked at her with fresh eyes instead of routine. I couldn't. And for the first time, it hit me. I had been faithful to the marriage but distant from the woman. I had built a fortress of responsibility and invited her to live inside it without asking if she felt loved there. Here's the choice in front of me now at 68. I can tell myself it's too late, that we've had a good run and that's enough. Or I can admit that I've been afraid of the very word that might change what time we have left. You might be thinking, at our age, what difference does it make? It makes all the difference. Because the night I realized this, she turned off the faucet, dried her hands and said quietly, "You've been far away lately. Even when you're standing right here." She wasn't angry. That would have been easier. She was tired. And in that moment, I understood something that scared me more than layoffs ever did. If I keep choosing safety over vulnerability, I won't lose my reputation. I won't lose my house. I'll lose the chance to truly love the woman who has stood beside me for 46 years. That's where this story begins. Not with betrayal. Not with scandal. With a man who finally sees the gap between staying and loving. And who has to decide whether he's brave enough to close it. The first time another woman said my name like it meant something, I felt it in my chest. And that scared me more than anything I confessed to you last time. Not because it was romantic. Not because it was inappropriate. But because I realized how long it had been since I'd heard my own name spoken with warmth inside my own house. If you're a man in your late 50s or 60s, you know what I'm talking about. Somewhere along the line your name becomes functional. Can you grab that? Did you pay this? Are you coming? It's logistics. It's partnership. It's life. But it's not always connection. Her name is Mary. She's 65. A widow for 3 years. Lives 2 houses down from us in the same quiet neighborhood where the trees are taller than our ambitions now. We had waved to each other for years. That was the extent of it. Then I started going to the community library on Thursday evenings. Local history talks. Men our age sitting in folding chairs, pretending we came for the speaker when really we came to feel less invisible. Mary was there one night, sitting 2 rows ahead of me. After the talk, I held the door open and she smiled and said, "Thank you, Richard." Not sir. Not neighbor. My name. It shouldn't have mattered. But it did. We walked toward the parking lot together, talking about the decline of steel towns, about how things used to feel more certain. She listened differently than most people. She didn't wait for her turn to speak. She asked questions. Real ones. What did you want to be, she asked me, before you became who everyone expected? No one had asked me that in 40 years. I laughed it off at first. Gave a safe answer. But the question followed me home. Now here's where I need to be honest with you. Nothing inappropriate happened. No secret lunches. No hidden messages. We spoke at the library, sometimes outside our mailboxes. That's it. But emotionally? Something shifted. Because when I talked to Mary, I found myself saying things I had never said out loud. Not even to my wife. I told her I used to sketch cars when I was a teenager. That I once thought about studying design. That I felt like I'd stepped into my father's life instead of building my own. And she didn't look at me like I was weak. She said, "You're not finished yet." I drove home unsettled. My wife was in the living room reading under the lamp. Same woman who stood by me through layoffs, through my career change in '92, through the stress of 2008 when we thought we might lose the house. She looked up and said, "How was the talk?" "Fine," I said. And right there was the internal choice again. I could tell her about the question. About the way it made me think. About how I felt seen. Or I could keep it simple. I chose simple. Over the next few weeks, Mary and I kept talking after the lectures. About the past. About fear. About what aging does to a man's sense of purpose. She once told me, loneliness isn't being alone. It's not being known. That line stayed with me. Because my wife and I weren't fighting. We weren't cold. We were efficient. We knew each other's routines. Medication schedules. Grocery preferences. But did we know each other now? One evening, as Mary and I stood outside under the parking lot lights, she said something that stopped me. "Your wife is lucky," she said. "You're steady." I almost corrected her. Instead, I felt a surge of guilt, not because I was doing something wrong, but because I realized I was giving another woman the emotional attention I had withheld at home. That's when the tension truly began. Here was my choice. Continue enjoying these conversations that made me feel alive, or turn inward and ask why I hadn't created that same space in my marriage. It would have been easy to drift. To tell myself, it's harmless. To justify it as intellectual companionship. But deep down I knew something important. The problem wasn't that Mary understood me. The problem was that I had stopped trying to be understood by my wife. One Thursday Mary asked, "Does your wife ever come to these talks?" I hesitated. "No. She's not really into this stuff." Mary nodded, then said gently, "Maybe she'd be into you talking about it." That hit harder than she intended. That night, instead of sitting in silence, I asked my wife, "Do you remember when we first moved here?" She looked surprised. Of course. We ended up talking for an hour. About the tiny kitchen in our first house. About the snowstorm in '83 when the power went out and we slept in coats. About dreams we had quietly shelved. It wasn't dramatic. No music swelling. No tears. But it felt different. Still, I won't pretend everything was fixed. There's a dangerous sweetness in being newly understood. And part of me looked forward to Thursdays more than I should have. The emotional shift came when I overheard something I wasn't meant to hear. My wife was on the phone with her sister. I wasn't spying. I just walked in as she said, "He's somewhere else lately. I don't think it's another woman. I think it's something inside him." Not anger. Not accusation. Distance. That scared me. Because I realized I stood at a quiet crossroads. Not between two women, but between two versions of myself. One who seeks validation where it feels easy. And one who turns back toward the woman who has shared his name for nearly half a century and says, "I want to try again." I haven't made the final move yet. But the tension is real now. Not outside my house, inside it. And for the first time in decades, I understand this. Emotional drift doesn't announce itself. It happens politely. Gradually. Respectably. Until one day you wake up and realize the most important person in your life feels like a careful roommate. I'm not proud of how close I came to letting that happen completely. And next time I'll tell you what forced me to confront it head on. I have faced layoffs, market crashes, and the morning my doctor said, "We need to run more tests." None of those moments shook me the way a simple sentence did in a grocery store aisle. "You're getting close to the line, Richard." It wasn't shouted. It wasn't dramatic. It was said quietly by a man I've known for 30 years. His name is Tom. We worked together back when I pivoted from steel into regional sales in the early '90s. Tom built his identity on reputation. Church board, Rotary Club, the kind of man who shakes hands firmly and keeps mental records of everyone else's missteps. He said it while standing beside a display of canned soup. I knew exactly what he meant. In a small neighborhood, patterns get noticed. Two older people talking regularly. Library nights. Longer conversations at the mailbox. Nothing improper. But visible. And visibility can turn into narrative. If you're a man in your late 50s or 60s, you understand this instinctively. Your name is currency. You spend decades building it. You don't gamble it lightly. I felt heat crawl up my neck, not because I was guilty of anything physical, but because I knew there was truth buried under his warning. Not about betrayal, but about drift. Tom leaned in slightly and said, "People talk." There it was. The unspoken threat. Now, I could have dismissed him. Told him to mind his business. But reputation isn't just pride. It's stability. It's the house, the church pew, the way your grown kids describe you. And for the first time, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Fear of losing dignity. That evening, the library talk was about economic shifts in the Midwest after the 2008 crisis. I barely heard a word. My mind kept replaying that aisle, that sentence. Mary noticed. "You seem distracted," she said as we stepped outside. I looked at her and realized something important. She had no idea what Tom had implied. No idea that her presence in my life, even in its innocent form, had become potential gossip. Here was the internal choice. I could distance myself immediately. Stop attending. Cut off the conversations. Protect the image. Or I could admit that the real issue wasn't perception. It was avoidance at home. Because if my marriage were truly alive, no one's comments would rattle me. Instead of answering her question directly, I said, "Do you ever worry what people think?" She gave a small smile. At 65? I'm more worried about whether I'm living honestly than whether I'm living neatly. That line stayed with me. Living honestly versus living neatly. I drove home under a sky heavy with clouds and my stomach felt tight. My wife was at the kitchen table paying bills. The same steady posture she's had for decades. She looked up and studied my face a little longer than usual. "What's wrong?" she asked. That question was different from the usual. How was it? It was perceptive. And there it was again, the choice. Tell her about Tom's comment. Tell her about the gossip risk. Tell her about the way talking to another woman had made me confront my own emotional laziness. Or protect myself by minimizing everything. For years I have chosen neat. That night I hesitated too long. She didn't push. She simply nodded and went back to her paperwork. And in that quiet movement, I saw something I hadn't wanted to admit. She had learned not to expect access to my inner world. The tension escalated 3 days later. Our daughter called. Casual conversation at first. Then she said lightly, "Dad, I heard you've made a new friend at the library." Not accusatory. Curious. But that's how narratives grow legs. I felt cornered, not by wrongdoing but by perception. I imagined whispers reshaping decades of steady living. I imagined my wife absorbing half-truths from outside voices instead of hearing them from me. This wasn't about temptation. It was about integrity. If I retreated now without explanation, it would confirm suspicion. If I continued without clarity, it would erode trust. That's when I understood the real antagonist in this story. Not Tom. Not Mary. My own habit of silence. The following Thursday, I walked into the library prepared to say something difficult. Mary greeted me with her usual calm warmth. We sat through the lecture. My pulse felt louder than the speaker's microphone. Afterward, under the dim parking lot lights, I told her, "I need to step back." She didn't look shocked, just attentive. "Why?" she asked. "Because I realized I've been using these conversations to avoid work I should be doing at home." "There," said. "No accusation. No drama. Just truth." She nodded slowly. "Then go do that work. No hurt pride. No manipulation. Just respect." Driving home, I felt both loss and relief. Not loss of romance, loss of the mirror she'd held up to me, but relief that I had drawn a clear boundary before someone else drew it for me. When I walked through the front door, my wife was watching the late news. I didn't sit in my usual chair. I sat beside her. "I need to tell you something before you hear it from someone else," I began. Her eyes sharpened slightly, not angry but alert. And that's where this episode closes. Right at that edge. Because what I was about to say could either reopen a 46-year-old marriage, or expose how fragile it had quietly become. For 3 nights, she slept facing the wall. Not dramatically. Not in anger. Just turned away. If you've been married as long as I have, you know that distance doesn't always arrive with shouting. Sometimes it arrives in inches. In silence. In the absence of a hand reaching across the mattress out of habit. After I told her about Mary, about the conversations, about Tom's comment in the grocery aisle, about my decision to step back, my wife listened without interrupting. That almost scared me more than if she had raised her voice. When I finished, she nodded once and said, "Thank you for telling me." That was it. No accusations. No interrogation. Just gratitude. But gratitude can carry grief inside it. The next morning she made coffee the way she always does. Measured. Steady. Asked if I wanted eggs. The routine remained intact. Yet something essential had shifted. I had finally chosen honesty over neatness. And honesty had consequences. If you're watching this and you've ever waited decades to speak a truth, you already know. Confession doesn't automatically fix anything. Sometimes it reveals how much repair is actually needed. By the 3rd night of her turning toward the wall, I felt the weight of a new fear. Not losing my reputation this time, not neighborhood gossip. Losing her trust. Not because she thought I had betrayed her physically. She told me clearly she didn't believe that. "I'm not worried about another woman," she said quietly the second evening. "I'm worried about how easily you could talk to someone else about your fears when you've never talked to me." That sentence landed harder than Tom's warning ever could. She wasn't accusing. She was asking a question beneath the surface. Why wasn't I the one you opened to? I didn't have a clean answer. The internal choice returned, sharper than before. I could defend myself, explain generational habits, emotional blind spots, the way men of our age were raised to compartmentalize. Or I could sit in discomfort and admit that she was right. I chose discomfort. "You're right," I said. It was easier because it was new. There was no history. She absorbed that. No immediate response. Over the next week, something subtle happened. She stopped asking about my day. Not coldly, just less. She spent more time on her phone in the evenings, texting our daughter, looking at photos of the grandchildren. I would glance over and realize how many moments I had half-inhabited across the decades. This wasn't punishment. It was protection. And that realization hurt. One afternoon, I came home from running errands and found a folder on the kitchen table. Inside were brochures from the local community college. She had circled a program in literature. I remembered, faintly, how in her 20s she talked about studying English. How in her 30s she asked about evening classes. How in her 40s I said, maybe when things settle. Things never settled. She walked into the kitchen while I was holding the folder. "I'm thinking of enrolling," she said. There was no hostility in her voice. Just resolve. In that moment, I felt something I hadn't expected. Fear of being left behind. Not abandoned, but outgrown. 4 years, I had assumed she would remain in the orbit of my schedule, my rhythms, my definitions of stability. Now she was quietly redefining her own. Here was the new choice. I could subtly discourage it, frame it as impractical at our age, inconvenient, unnecessary. Or I could step aside from my ego and support the part of her I had unintentionally sidelined. The old version of me would have smiled and said, "Whatever makes you happy," without deeper engagement. The newer version, still learning, took a breath and asked, "What made you choose literature?" She looked surprised, then thoughtful. "I miss thinking deeply," she said. "I miss being challenged." There it was again. Not about classes. About aliveness. I realized that while I had been confronting my emotional distance, she had been confronting her own quiet shrinking. Our distance hadn't begun last month. It had been a slow mutual retreat. One evening, about 10 days after my confession, she sat beside me on the couch instead of across the room. Not touching. Just closer. "I'm not angry," she said. "But I need to know something." I waited. "Are you trying to fix us because you're afraid of being alone? Or because you actually want me?" That question cut straight through every comfortable excuse I've ever built. It would have been easy to say the right thing. The expected thing. Instead I paused. And that pause mattered. Because I had to answer honestly, not perform affection, not respond out of fear. "I'm afraid of losing you," I admitted. But more than that, I'm ashamed that it took another person reflecting me back to realize how much I'd stopped trying here. Her eyes softened, but they didn't close the gap entirely. Healing at this stage of life isn't dramatic. It's cautious. And here's the emotional shift that defines this chapter. I understood that love at 68 is not about reclaiming youth. It's about earning trust again in small, consistent ways. Still, the tension remains. Because choosing honesty doesn't guarantee reconciliation. Supporting her college plans doesn't erase decades of partial presence. The wall she turned toward those first 3 nights? It's gone now. But so is the illusion that time alone will carry us. And as I sit here telling you this, I know the next conversation, the one where she decides how much of her heart she's willing to reopen, hasn't fully happened yet. We're closer. But closeness, I've learned, is not a permanent state. It's a daily decision. And I'm finally ready to see what that decision truly costs. I almost lost her without a fight. Not to another man. Not to illness. Not to scandal. I almost lost her to 46 years of emotional convenience. If you've stayed with me through this story, you already know the pattern. I provided, I protected, I stayed. What I didn't do, at least not consistently, was choose her with intention. And here's the part that's hardest to admit at 68. I thought time would do the choosing for me. It doesn't. The mature decision I had to make wasn't dramatic. It didn't involve packing bags or grand gestures. It was quieter than that. It was this. I had to decide whether I was willing to become emotionally uncomfortable for the rest of my life. Because that's what real closeness demands. The night it shifted for good wasn't planned. She had just returned from her first literature class. She looked different, not younger, not transformed, but engaged. Awake. She set her notebook on the table and began telling me about a poem they discussed. I listened. Not halfway. Not while checking my phone. Not with one eye on the television. Fully. At one point she paused and said almost suspiciously, "You're really listening." "I am," I said. "That may sound small to you. But for us it was new." Later that evening, I asked her to sit down at the kitchen table. The same table where we've paid bills, discussed college funds, argued about retirement plans. I didn't have a script. Just clarity. "I need to say this without dressing it up," I began. "I have been a loyal husband. But I have not always been a loving one." She didn't interrupt. I confused stability with intimacy. I hid behind responsibility. And when someone outside this house asked me questions I should have been asking myself for years, I realized how much I had held back from you. There were no tears. No dramatic music in the background of our lives. Just 2 older people facing the truth. She folded her hands and asked, "Why now?" That's the question you might be asking too. Why now at 68? Because funerals change you. Because silence grows heavy. Because seeing your wife consider a future that doesn't revolve around you forces you to examine who you've actually been. "I don't want to spend the last chapter of our lives as polite roommates," I said. "I want to know you again. Even if it feels awkward." There it was. No promise of perfection. No guarantee of fireworks. Just intention. Here's where the final internal choice came in. I could ask for forgiveness as a shortcut. Seek reassurance. Push for immediate closeness to soothe my own fear. Or I could accept that rebuilding trust takes time and that she has every right to move cautiously. I chose patience. She leaned back in her chair and looked at me in a way she hadn't in years, measuring, thoughtful. "I've been lonely too," she admitted. But I stopped asking for more because I didn't think you knew how to give it. That stung. Not because it was cruel, but because it was accurate. I'm learning, I said. Late, but I'm learning. We didn't solve everything that night. We didn't list grievances. We didn't rewrite history. What we did was agree on something simple and surprisingly powerful. Every evening after dinner we would sit together for 20 minutes with no screens and talk. About anything. Past, present, worry, memory. 20 minutes. It doesn't sound romantic. It sounds practical. But consistency is the most romantic thing two aging people can offer each other. Weeks have passed since that conversation. Some nights the talks flow easily. Other nights we sit in silence before one of us finds a thread to pull. We've spoken about her mother's death in ways we never did. About my fear during the layoffs in the 80s. About the pressure I felt in 2008 when the market collapsed and I thought I'd failed us. I told her something I had never said out loud. I was terrified you'd see me as weak. She replied gently, I wanted to see you as human. That sentence alone was worth 46 years of learning. There are no fairy tale endings at our age. No reinvention montages. What there is, though, is steadiness with awareness. Mary still lives 2 houses down. We nod politely if our paths cross. There's no tension, no secret. Just acknowledgement of what that season revealed. Tom still shops at the same grocery store. His opinions matter less now. What matters is this. When my wife reaches for her mug in the morning, our hands sometimes touch, and it's intentional, not accidental. The emotional shift isn't dramatic. It's grounded. I used to think regret was something you carried alone. A private ledger of missed chances. Now I see it differently. Regret can be a doorway, if you walk through it instead of hiding from it. At 68, I can't undo the decades where I mistook endurance for love. But I can choose presence today. I can say the words I once avoided. I can ask the questions I once feared. And here's the calm truth I've arrived at. Loving someone late is still loving them. It may not be youthful. It may not be poetic. But it's honest. And for the first time in my life, honesty feels stronger than silence.